Hello everyone, my name is Lindsay Cohen and today I'm going to be walking you through my art gallery. In many ways, the human body is how we express ourselves. Our bodies express our sexuality, our race, gender, ethnicity, and is the center of how we view others. The same goes for our artwork. Over thousands of years, artists have been expressing themselves through art in the form of the human body. Now, throughout this gallery, I'm going to be discussing 6 pieces of art, all of which depict the human body in different ways. The first piece of art that I'd like to discuss is this beautiful piece. It's called The Lamentation of Christ. This was created in 1305, painted by Giotto. Now, the style here is naturalism. It's biblical art or pre-Renaissance. It is late medieval period moving towards what is now known as the Renaissance. He shows more realistic people and real emotion, which was revolutionary of his time. The word laminate actually means to grieve, and that is the subject of this piece. This painting depicts the scene just after Christ had been cut down from the cross and is surrounded by grieving loved ones. The composition of this painting is simple. Mary is holding Christ on her lap. Her right knee is used to prop him up. Her body is draped over him and her arms are wrapped around him. Mary has clear and evident devastation on her face. She looks as though she is pleading with Christ to wake up. The idea of representing Christ as dead is a modern idea because it allows Christ to be human rather than the spiritual idea that he was viewed as thus far. The body language of the loved ones who surround Christ is in a similar manner. Each is hunched forward towards Christ. They're weeping. Some have their hands up in disbelief. Others have their hands clasped by their face. You have Mary Magdalene at Christ's feet, which shows a biblical tradition as she anointed his feet. These figures have individuality in their expression and their body language. Emphasis is placed mostly on the figures. You might expect to see Christ in the center because he is the focal point of the painting, but Giotto has him off to the left, and he uses the landscape to aid in drawing your gaze towards him and Mary. He has this big sweeping hill angled towards the scene, the background. The background is very simple and plain, so that also aids in bringing the focus to the figures. The two figures with their backs to the audience creates an illusion of space, framing Mary and Christ. So Giotto was so interested in the naturalism of this painting that he painted 2 figures where you cannot see their face. They provide absolutely no information, no narrative to the painting whatsoever, but they aid in creating the illusion of space, bringing the audience into the picture. You really feel like you're there, it brings you closer. The angels in the sky also create space in this art. Giotto was telling the story of Christ. He had painted many other pictures throughout the chapel where this painting lives, and they all depict stories of the Bible. He paired a lot of the Old Testament stories with New Testament stories, specifically Old Testament stories that prefigured Christ's life, that helped tell the story of Christ. This is a very emotional and moving painting. The next piece of art I'd like to talk about is this beautiful sculpture of David. The exact creation date is unknown, but it is believed to have been created between 1430 and 1440. Now, this sculpture is Donatello's interpretation of David. This is an iconic Renaissance sculpture and is known as one of the greatest sculptures of the Quattrocento. David embodies many of the concerns and ideas of this time in Florence. The exact date, as I said earlier, is unclear, but it was first recorded as the centerpiece of the first courtyard in the Palazzo Medici during the wedding of Lorenzo de' Medici and Clarice Orsini in 1469. The sculpture is credited with being the first nude sculpture since classical antiquity. Classical antiquity is also known as the classical era, which is a term used for a long period of history that was centered along the Mediterranean Sea. So that includes ancient Greece and ancient Rome. You can also call it the Greco-Roman world. The popularity of sculpting David grew immensely from this sculpture, as you can now see many different sculptures of David in several different museums all around the world. The subject of David was extremely important to the Florentine people as well as the Medici people for many reasons. They really felt that they could identify with David. He wasn't just a Bible story to them. The story goes, though, that David defeats his enemy, Goliath, with the help of God, even though David was the underdog. And Florence believed they too defeated their enemy, the Duke of Milan, with God's help. David is a symbol of freedom and liberty that the Florentine people cherish greatly. David also embodies the promise of a long leadership and youthfulness as he grows up to be a beloved king. Although this sculpture represents war, it also represents victory and peace. And I believe that was Donatello's story behind his David. Donatello brought back the beauty and love and respect of the human body that the Greeks and Romans once had, but was unfortunately lost in Western Christianity. He also referred to the Romans and Greek sculptures for the positioning of David, as David's in a relaxed pose or contrapposto. Contrapposto is an asymmetrical arrangement of the body where the line of the arms and shoulders contrast while balancing the hips and legs. For the Renaissance era, this figure looked remarkably alive and fluid. This sculpture was anatomic for its time, as it could get up and move on its own. It stood alone from any other label of art during this time period. David has a sensuality and eroticism to him in his body language. His weight is placed mostly on one leg while the other leg is bent. He has one arm bent with his hand on his hip. His head is tilted down. He wears only a hat and boots and is standing on the newly severed head of Goliath. He holds in one hand Goliath's metal sword, the sword he just used to sever his head. In the other hand, he holds the rock that he used to first bring the giant down. Is it possible that Donatello shows the two weapons David's holding as the two opposing cities? The metal sword representing the violence of Milan versus the rock that represents the culture of Florence? Was this further symbolic? The next painting I would like to discuss with you is called The Elevation of the Cross. This beautiful, intense painting made in 1610. The creator of this painting is Peter Paul Rubens. And this is a beautiful, heroic Catholic Baroque painting that hangs above an altar in a cathedral in Antwerp. The term Baroque can have many different meanings in reference to art, depending on where in the world you're from during the 1600s. Now, Rubens was from Spain, and he was commissioned from the church to make this painting, as the church controlled much of Europe at the time. The church would often pay for artists to create art for the public. So this was a public painting, and Peter Paul Rubens shows Michelangelo as a great influence over this work. Rubens went to Italy for 8 years and studied art in Italy, where he particularly found interest in Michelangelo. So this painting tells the story of the Bible. In this painting, Rubens depicts 9 executioners struggling and straining to lift the cross on which Christ is nailed. This painting is vivid and intense and grotesque. The men are painted with such massive muscles and contortion in their bodies and power. You can see the struggle in their body language to lift that cross. You can tell it's so heavy. The figures are all sort of joined together almost as one figure, and the intensity gradually increases as you move up the painting, and Christ's body cuts right across the painting, diagonally across it. The body of Christ is painted beautifully as well. It's divine and majestic and powerful. There's even a bit of sensuality in his demeanor, in the power and the way he twists his body and contorts on the cross. His body has many curves and defined muscles. He's draped in only a simple loincloth covering him. And he gazes up to God with this look of forgiveness. This look of, please, Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Common in Baroque, the painting is split into two diagonal lines. It gives it a sense that it's receding into space. The realism here is in the struggle of the men and how much power it takes to actually raise that heavy cross. This painting is extremely theatrical and dramatic. It's real and ugly. Rubens chooses to use natural colors and tones, but they're used so dramatically. This painting is really alive. The next piece of work that I'd like to go over with you is called The Oath of the Horatii. And this was painted in 1785. It was painted by Jacques-Louis David. And this is a neoclassical style of art, or actually the birth of neoclassical art. It's displaying a scene from the revolutionary history of France. This painting hangs in the Louvre Museum in Paris. And like I said, it was painted in 1785, and that's just 4 years before the French Revolution. So this is an extremely controversial painting that depicts a complicated story. This painting is telling a story of two neighboring cities, Rome and Alba, who were constantly at odds and decided to go to war. A bit untraditional, the cities agreed to settle their disagreement by picking 3 fighters from each side to go to battle, and whoever won that battle would win the war. The Horatii brothers were chosen from Rome and the Caracci from Alba. This, in the middle of the painting, their father, the Horatii brothers' father, is holding their swords up above his head, and the brothers have their arms up towards their dad. This is the focal point of the painting. And the sons are pledging their oath to their father that they will fight to the death for their beloved Rome. There are women behind the men, their relatives, and they're clearly in mourning. They're hunched over. They're very sad expressions on their face. And one of the women is actually married to a Caracci brother. When the Horatii brothers come home, they have won the battle. Rome is victorious. And one of the brothers killed the sister due to her lack of patriotism and faithfulness to her country. What David is trying to express is that one should be driven by virtue and love for one's country rather than personal gain. I think that was the hidden message behind this painting. He brings the idea of sacrifice to the painting. He believes that the country, his country could pull through any rough time if they stick together and work as one. And this was an extremely powerful idea at this time, because the aristocracy in France, they were living a life of luxury and wealth, and while the rest of the country was in poverty. So it was a very deep message, a very, very real message. As I said before, the French Revolution only came 4 years later. The picture is simple, symmetrical, and linear. It's divided into 3 identical arches in the background in a Doric style order. Doric order was one of the 3 orders of the ancient Greek and is easily recognized by the simple circular capitals at the top of the columns. David uses raking light, giving it a sharp contrast. And the people are linear as well. It's a realistic perspective of the anatomy shown in this piece of art. It shows David's interest in classical antiquity. They resemble the Greek perspectives of the human body. Their body's contour and details of the bodies can be seen from underneath their clothing. You can see the muscle and curvature of their body. The men are hard and rigid and firm, while the women are more curved and soft. The style of the painting in itself tells the story, tells the severity of this topic. The geometrical shapes in itself, so it's simplified, showing the severity of the topic at hand. Moving on to this beautiful painting of Olympia, created in 1865, was created by Eduardo Monet. This painting was likely modeled after Titian's Venus of Urbano. Although Olympia is not protected by being a goddess, Olympia is a prostitute. This painting, just by this simple manner of it, created a lot of controversy and conversation, as Monet does something extremely radical and modern and challenges the idea of what art was at this time. He was rebellious to academic art. He was not afraid to treat his painting like a painting, which he was criticized for greatly. At this time, it was very common to see women painted nude. This wasn't something new. However, in most cases, the women were goddesses. So you're removing the idea of sexuality. Olympia is a real woman, and she's not trying to hide her naked body. She's not shying away from the reality of her being. She lays on a couch, her body twists slightly towards the audience, and she's reclined back. Her glaring gaze looks out at the viewer, which made some very uncomfortable. Her face is angular and flawed, and she's not beautiful in the traditional sense. She has thin lips, undefined features. When you look at this painting, you are confronted with Olympia's sexuality. There's no way to look at her and not think about sex or not know that this picture is about sex. Her body is hardly modeled. She's flat looking, and there isn't a lot of color to her. But where Monet chose to model were her hands, and that draws your attention to her hands that are resting near her genitals. And some wonder that if that doesn't suggest that maybe she's dirty, or Monet is depicting the uncleanliness of her lifestyle, or if he's drawing attention to her sexuality even more. Like I said, her body is hardly modeled. Her boobs, her stomach is very undefined. This picture is vulgar and it's real. Monet was throwing the harsh reality and corruption of Paris at the time into this painting, as well as being completely honest about the construction of this painting. The last piece of art that I would like to talk to you about is this piece of art called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And this was constructed in 1907 by the famous Spanish painter Picasso. It was made in Paris, and as Olympia, this is a very controversial painting as well. This is depicting a brothel. The style of art is Cubism or Renaissance Cubism. It's abstract. It looks like shattered glass. And Picasso was a huge influence for Cubism and development of Cubism. He was at the forefront of this type of art. and it revolutionized the European style of art during the 20th century. The title in itself refers to a street in Barcelona, and like I said, it's located in a brothel. The picture depicts five women who work in this brothel. Their bodies are disordered and broken and fractured. There's a lot of tension and anger in the way the women are created. You can sense the animosity when you look at this picture. It's raw and it's ugly. It's real. Picasso uses no linear perspective here. He uses no light or shadowing to create contrast, yet there is a three-dimensional illusion. Some of the women you feel as though you're looking at directly, while some of the other women, particularly the one middle left, it looks like you're looking down upon her. She may be laying in a bed and she has the curtains or the sheets kind of wrapped between her legs, but all their gazes are turned towards the viewer. The women on the left are wearing African masks, which Picasso was known to have some sort of a mystery or about Africa. It was so foreign to him that he was drawn to that culture and he wanted to study that culture, learn more about the African culture. It scared him a bit. It was scary to him. Picasso removes the actual space between the women here, as he had many different drafts of this painting, but there's still some sense of illusion that goes back into space a bit. And the women seem so close to the viewer. Picasso was seeking a completely new visual language and expressed his many emotions in this painting. He has reminded us that the pleasures in life are short and dangerous. I hope that you enjoyed my art gallery. Thank you for joining me.